The cold was a physical thing in that town, a presence that had teeth and a will of its own. It gnawed at the edges of the plank buildings, sank its fangs into the frozen mud of the main street, and breathed a fog so thick it seemed to swallow sound. For the woman huddled in the sliver of space between the general store and the assayer's office, the cold was a predator, and she knew she and the small child bundled against her were its intended prey. They were ghosts in this place, their desperation as invisible to the bustling, thick-coated townsfolk as the air itself. Their clothes, thin and dark and made for a city far away and long ago, were a mockery of the biting reality of the high country. They offered no more protection from the wind than a prayer would from a wolf. The woman, whose name had not been spoken aloud by a friendly voice in months, felt the last of her strength beginning to fray. She had been strong for so long, a pillar for the little girl who now shivered uncontrollably in her arms. The child was a bundle of bones wrapped in threadbare wool, her breath coming in shallow, frosty puffs. The woman pulled their single, ragged blanket tighter, a useless gesture that was more about the memory of warmth than the creation of it. Her own hunger was a dull, constant ache she had long ago learned to ignore, but the child's was a sharp, piercing guilt that twisted in her gut. She had failed her. They had run so far only to die of something as simple and as absolute as the cold. She watched the people pass, their faces pinched and hard, their eyes sliding past the two of them as if they were nothing more than a heap of discarded rags. They were an inconvenience, a stain on the town's rugged, self-sufficient pride. Then a shape detached itself from the swirling snow and the rhythm of the town's indifference. It was a man, solid and deliberate, his form broad enough to block the wind for a moment as he stopped before them. He was not a creature of the town. His clothes were worn buckskin and thick wool, practical and devoid of any ornament. A heavy beard, dusted with ice, covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a flat, unreadable gray. He did not look at her with pity, a currency she had come to despise for its uselessness. Instead, he observed them with a quiet, searching attention, his gaze taking in the inadequate shoes, the hollows of her cheeks, the fierce, protective way she held the child. He saw not a beggar, but a problem of logistics, a thing that was out of place. He stood there for a long moment, the silence broken only by the keening of the wind. The woman braced herself for the inevitable dismissal, the gruff command to move along. Instead, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the very ground beneath them. "I need a mender," he said, the words clipped, stripped of all preamble. "Someone to cook. The cabin is empty." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains that loomed over the town, their peaks lost in the gray maelstrom. "The storm is coming in proper. Another day out here, and the girl won't see the thaw." It was not an offer of charity. It was a statement of fact, a transaction proposed. His need laid bare next to hers. She stared at him, the directness of his words cutting through the fog of her exhaustion. He was offering a choice that was no choice at all, a remote cabin with a stranger or a certain freezing death in an alley. There was no kindness in his face, only a stark pragmatism that was, in its own way, more reassuring than a gentle smile would have been. Kindness could be a mask, but this man's face was as honest and unforgiving as the landscape he inhabited. She looked down at the child, whose shivering had begun to subside into a terrifying lethargy. That decided it. Pride was a luxury for the warm and the fed. She gave a single, sharp nod, a motion so small it was almost lost in the wind. The man held her gaze for another second, then turned and walked toward a large freight wagon hitched near the end of the street, not once looking back to see if they were following. He knew they would. Survival left no room for other options. The journey to his homestead was a silent battle against the elements. The wind rose to a furious howl, driving pellets of ice and snow that stung any exposed skin. The man handled the team of heavy-shouldered horses with an economy of motion, his hands sure and steady on the reins. He had hoisted the woman and child into the back of the wagon, onto a pile of canvas-covered supplies, without a word. After a few minutes on the trail, he reached back and tossed a thick, coarse wool blanket over them. It was a gesture of impersonal care, the same way a man might cover a valuable piece of equipment to protect it from the weather. The blanket smelled of pine smoke, leather, and a faint, lingering scent of solitude. The woman wrapped it around the child first, then herself, and watched the lights of the town disappear behind them, swallowed by the storm. They were moving deeper into the vast, white emptiness, into a world that belonged entirely to the man who drove the wagon. She felt a tremor of fear, sharp and cold, but it was overshadowed by the simple, animal relief of being out of the wind. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon rumbled to a halt. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the dark, solid shape of a cabin, with a barn and a few smaller outbuildings huddled nearby like calves seeking warmth from their mother. A single, pale yellow light glowed in one window, a lonely beacon in the immense darkness. The man set the brake, climbed down, and came to the back of the wagon. "We're here," he said, the two words all the announcement that was needed. He lifted the child, who was now limp with a combination of cold and exhaustion, and carried her inside as if she weighed nothing. The woman scrambled down after him, her limbs stiff and clumsy, and followed him through the door. The inside of the cabin was a single large room, dominated by a stone fireplace where a low fire crackled. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, a physical blow after the hours of brutal cold. The space was brutally simple, scrubbed clean but profoundly empty. There was a large wooden table with two chairs, a bed built into one corner, and shelves holding a few books and basic provisions. Every object had a purpose. There was no softness, no clutter, no sign of a life lived with anyone else. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it, a shelter against the world, and nothing more. The silence inside was deeper than the silence of the snow-covered mountains. It was a silence born of absence, heavy and old. He placed the sleeping child on the thick furs of his own bed, then turned to the hearth and began to ladle a thick, dark stew from a pot suspended over the fire. He set a bowl on the table for the woman and gestured for her to sit. She did, her body trembling now with the shock of the warmth. She ate ravenously, the hot stew a shock to her system. She did not look at him, focused only on the food, on the primal, desperate need to refuel her own dying embers. The man did not eat. He stood by the fire, watching her with a detached curiosity, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He was a man assessing a tool he had just acquired, gauging its condition, wondering if it would serve its purpose. The gulf between them was immense. She was a creature of pure, raw need, and he was the solid, unmovable fact of her survival. When she had finished, scraping the bowl clean, he took it from her without a word. He pointed to a ladder leading up to a loft that ran along one side of the cabin. "You and the girl will sleep there," he said. "There are blankets." The words established a clear boundary. He had provided a roof and a meal, but the space, the life, remained his own. She was a necessity he had acquired, like a new axe or a sack of flour. She understood. She climbed the ladder and found a clean, bare space with a pile of thick wool blankets and buffalo hides. She looked down. The man was already making a makeshift bed for himself on the floor by the fire, rolling himself in a heavy cloak. He did not look up. The kindness she had received felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself, a thing to be handled with care, lest it be taken away as quickly as it had been given. She retrieved the child from his bed, carried her to the loft, and wrapped them both in the heavy furs, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet, measured breathing of the stranger below. The storm locked them inside for 3 days. It was a time of quiet adjustment, of learning the silent rhythms of the man and his house. He was restless, a creature of constant, methodical work. He rose before the sun, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards the first sound of the day. He would tend the fire, check on the animals in the barn. A journey he made through the blinding snow, like a man walking through his own living room, and then returned to the cabin to work. He mended tack with practiced, efficient hands, sharpened blades on a whetstone until they gleamed, and sat for long stretches staring into the fire, his thoughts a closed and distant country. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to issue a simple instruction or state a plain fact. The woman and her sister May stayed mostly in the loft, a pocket of their own quiet existence suspended above his. From there she watched him, learning the geography of his solitude. She saw the way his hands, so capable and rough, would sometimes, still in the middle of a task, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the cabin walls. She saw that there was only one cup on the shelf that showed regular use, though two others sat beside it, gathering a thin film of dust. The cabin was not just empty, it was hollowed out. On the fourth morning, the world was born anew, silent and blindingly white. The storm had broken, leaving behind a landscape of impossible beauty and immense labor. The man stood at the open cabin door, surveying the damage. "A section of fence is down by the north pasture," he announced to the room at large. Calves likely wandered off. He began pulling on his heavy coat, preparing to head out into the deep snow. It was the challenge they had been waiting for, the moment the transaction of their rescue would be called due. The woman came down the ladder, her sister trailing shyly behind her. "We will help," she said. It was not a plea or a question. It was a statement. She would not be a sheltered pet, a helpless burden. They would earn their keep. The man turned, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or irritation, in his gray eyes. The snow is deep, the work is hard. He was dismissing her, protecting his solitude as much as he was protecting her from the cold. But she stood her ground, her chin lifted. "We are not made of glass," she replied, her voice steady. He looked from her to the small, determined face of her sister, and then back again. He saw a resolve that matched his own, a quiet defiance that refused to be categorized as mere weakness. After a long moment, he gave a curt nod. "Get your coats," he said, and turned back to the door. It was a reluctant agreement, an admission into his world of work. Out in the field, the cold was sharp and clean. The woman, whose name was Lynn, proved him wrong. Despite her thin frame, she was possessed of a wiry strength and an observant mind. While he struggled through the deep drifts, his focus on the broken fence line, it was she who spotted the faint, almost invisible trail of the lost calf leading toward a thicket of aspen. She pointed it out, and together they found the shivering animal, trapped in a deep drift. The man worked to free it, his movements powerful and sure, while Lynn soothed the frightened creature with a low, gentle murmur, her small hands stroking its neck. He watched her for a moment, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. It was the sound of a voice that was not his own, a soft sound in a world that had been silent for too long. Later, as they worked to mend the fence, her fingers, though numb with cold, were nimble and quick, tying the wire with a precision that surprised him. He had expected helplessness, but he found competence. He had expected a burden, but he found a partner. During their work, a small carved wooden bird fell from a pouch inside his coat. He snatched it up quickly, his face tightening, and shoved it back deep into his pocket. Lynn saw it, the smooth, worn wood, the simple shape of a meadowlark. She saw the flicker of raw pain in his eyes before the mask of stoicism fell back into place. And she looked away, granting him the privacy of a grief she was beginning to understand. She had seen the dust on the extra cups. This was not just the home of a solitary man, it was the tomb of a family. The need for supplies eventually drove them back to town. The journey felt different this time. Lynn and May sat on the wagon seat beside him, no longer cargo but passengers. The fragile peace they had built in the isolated cabin felt thin and vulnerable as they approached the world of other people. The town seemed to have grown more hostile in their absence, its judgmental eyes colder. As the man, Elias, conducted his business in the mercantile, Lynn felt the weight of those stares. Whispers followed them like smoke, curling around the edges of conversations. It was then that the social tyrant of the town made her appearance. She was a wealthy widow, a woman whose power was derived from gossip and the careful maintenance of the town's rigid social order. She swept into the store, her expensive wool coat a stark, clean black against the dusty interior, her face a carefully constructed mask of pious concern. She approached Elias with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Elias," she cooed, her voice carrying through the suddenly quiet store. "So good to see you down from that lonely mountain of yours." Her gaze slid over to Lynn and May, dismissing them as one might dismiss a piece of furniture before turning back to him. "I hear you've taken on charity cases." The words were coated in false sweetness, but their intent was venomous. "Such a good Christian man you are. Though one must be careful of the company one keeps. People will talk. They'll wonder what a man alone needs with that kind of help." The insinuation hung in the air, thick and ugly. She was not just questioning his judgment, she was publicly shaming him. attempting to soil his reputation and, by extension, cast Lynn and her sister as something dirty, something dangerous. The other customers in the store stopped their browsing, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruel anticipation. Lynn felt a hot flush of shame and anger. She wanted to shrink away, to become invisible again, but she also felt a fierce, protective instinct for the man who had owned harsh, pragmatic form of grace. Before she could react, Elias moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but it was definitive. He stepped slightly to the side, placing his body partially between the widow and Lynn. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet authority was a palpable force in the room. "They work for me, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice low and even, cutting through her saccharine tone like a cold chisel through soft wood. He met her gaze directly, his winter sky eyes holding hers without flinching. "Their business is my business, and they are under my protection." The words were simple, declarative, and absolute. They were a line drawn in the sand, a wall erected around them, under my protection. The phrase echoed in the silent store. It was more than a defense, it was a claim. Mrs. Gable's smile faltered, her mask of piety cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. She had expected him to be embarrassed, to stammer an excuse. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable defiance. Sputtering, she offered a tight, clipped, "Well, I never," before turning on her heels and sweeping out of the store, her public shaming having backfired into a public defeat. The other customers quickly went back to their business, refusing to meet Elias's gaze. The confrontation was over, but the warning shot had been fired. The fragile peace of the mountain cabin had been shattered. They were no longer just a man and his hired help. They were a fortress under siege. The silence on the wagon ride home was heavy with unspoken things, the comfortable quiet replaced by a new, shared tension. That evening, the unspoken things in the cabin grew too loud to bear. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, but it could not warm the new chill that had settled between them. The confrontation in town had changed the nature of their arrangement. Elias was no longer just an employer. He had declared himself a protector, and in doing so, had invited the town's scorn into his solitary life. Lynn sat on the hearth, watching the flames, feeling the weight of the debt she owed him, a debt that now went far beyond simple food and shelter. She had to understand. She turned to him where he sat at the table, polishing a piece of leather with slow, methodical strokes. "Why?" she asked, her voice small but clear in the quiet room. "Why did you help us? Why did you defend us?" Elias's hands stilled. He stared down at the leather for a long time, so long that she thought he would not answer. The silence stretched, filled with the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if dredged up from a deep, unused well. "This place," he began, his gaze distant, fixed on a memory only he could see. After they were gone, the silence was a living thing. It was too loud. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers, and for the first time she saw past the stoic mask to the vast, barren landscape of his grief. "My wife, Sarah, my daughter, Lily. A fever took them both one winter 5 years back." He didn't elaborate on the pain, the helplessness. He didn't have to. It was carved into the lines around his eyes, built into the very walls of the hollowed-out cabin. "I thought I wanted the quiet. I thought I wanted to be left alone. But there's a difference between quiet and empty. This cabin, it had too much nothing in it." He looked toward the loft where May slept. "Seeing you two in that alley, it was a different kind of nothing, a nothing that could be fixed. I thought maybe bringing you here would make for a better kind of silence." It was a confession of profound loneliness, a revelation that his act of rescue had been as much for himself as for them. The stark honesty of his words unlatched something deep inside Lynn. His grief was a mirror to her own desperate flight. In the face of his vulnerability, she could offer her own. She reached into the small pouch she wore around her neck and pulled out a small flat pendant of jade, chipped at one edge. "My father worked for the railroad," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He took a loan from the company to bring us over. He died in a tunnel collapse before it was paid." She held the pendant up to the firelight. "This was my mother's. It's all I have left of her. After my father died, the debt fell to me. The company man, a Mr. Sterling, he didn't see the debt in coin. He saw it in me. The shame and fear of her past were a bitter taste in her mouth, but she pushed on, needing him to understand the true nature of the danger. He owned the contract. He believed he owned me. I took my sister and I ran. I thought if we could get far enough west, we could disappear. She looked at Elias, her eyes pleading for him to comprehend the gravity of her confession. The woman in the store, her whispers, they are a nuisance, but Mr. Sterling, he is a hunter, and he will not stop looking for his property. The exchange hung in the air between them, two stories of loss and survival laid bare. The fragile, transactional relationship they had built was gone, burned away by the heat of their shared truths. He was no longer a man filling an empty space, and she was no longer just a stray he had taken in. They were survivors of different shipwrecks, now stranded on the same shore. Elias looked at the jade pendant, then at her face, and he finally understood. The threat was not the town's prejudice. The true danger was coming for them from the past. He realized then that he had not just offered them a roof, he had inadvertently offered them a fortress, and now he knew he would have to defend it. The arrival of the ultimate threat did not come as a surprise, but its form was more chillingly civilized than Lynn had imagined. It was not a posse of rough men that rode up to the homestead, but a single, polished black carriage drawn by two magnificent black horses. A man stepped out, his suit immaculate, his boots polished to a high sheen that seemed to scoff at the mud of the yard. It was Mr. Sterling. He moved with an unearned confidence, a smug self-assurance that spoke of a man accustomed to getting his way. He saw people not as human beings, but as assets on a ledger, debts to be collected. Mrs. Gable sat in the carriage, a spectator at a drama she had helped orchestrate, her face alight with vindicated triumph. Sterling did not waste time on pleasantries. He approached the cabin where Elias stood on the porch, a silent, immovable obstacle. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Sterling said, his voice smooth and cold. He produced a sheaf of papers from his inner coat pocket with a flourish. An indenture contract, legally binding in every territory. It stipulates that the female, Lynn, and her dependent sibling are the property of the Transcontinental Railway Company until such time as her father's debt is paid in full. As he is deceased, the asset reverts to the company. I am here to collect. He presented the document with the air of a man playing a winning card. It was an ultimatum, wrapped in the cold language of law. I have spoken with the town marshal. He agrees the document is ironclad. You have 3 days to hand them over. After that, he will be obliged to assist me in retrieving my property. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. I suggest you do not make this difficult. After Sterling's departure, a suffocating despair settled over the cabin. The contract was a cage of ink and paper, and it seemed inescapable. But as the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by a grim determination. The cabin became a war room. Lynn, her fear channeled into a focused intensity, revealed a skill she had kept hidden. She could read English fluently and possessed a keen understanding of accounting, learned from years of watching the company clerks. They are cheats, she insisted, poring over the contract Sterling had left behind. Their books are always crooked. There must be a mistake, a loophole. They spent hours examining the document, searching for any flaw, any inconsistency. Elias, meanwhile, paced the floor, his mind at racing. He knew they could not fight Sterling on his own terms. The law, in a place like this, bent toward money and power. He needed a different kind of weapon. On the second day, he made a decision. He rode hard into town, avoiding the main street, and went straight to the telegraph office. He handed the operator a slip of paper with a short, coded message and a destination address in a city hundreds of miles to the east. It was a name and a place from a life he had left behind long ago, a contact from a time when he had dealt in information and influence, not livestock and timber. It was a desperate, long-shot gamble, a message in a bottle thrown into a vast and uncertain sea. The third day dawned cold and gray. The deadline had arrived. Just before noon, Sterling's carriage reappeared, this time accompanied by the town marshal on horseback. The marshal looked uncomfortable, his duty warring with his conscience, but the law was the law. Mrs. Gable was there again, her presence a clear signal to the rest of the town that a final judgment was about to be rendered. They dismounted, and Sterling, smirking, approached the cabin. "Time is up," he declared. Elias stood on the porch, Lynn and May behind him. He looked not at Sterling but at the marshal. "This contract is a fraud," he stated, his voice calm and steady. Sterling laughed. "A desperate claim from a desperate man. Show him the paper." "Marshal, it's all there in black and white." The marshal, his face grim, held up the contract. It looked, to all intents and purposes, perfectly legal. The moment stretched, thick with tension. The fortress was about to fall, and then a new sound broke the tense silence. The frantic drumming of horses' hooves. A lone rider was galloping up the trail from town, pushing his horse to its limit. It was the young man from the telegraph office. He slid from the saddle, breathing hard, and thrust a telegram into the marshal's hand. "This just came," he panted. "Marked urgent. From the federal marshal's office back east." The marshal tore open the envelope. As he read, his entire demeanor changed. His eyes widened, his face hardening from reluctant duty to cold fury. He looked up from the paper, his gaze locking onto a suddenly pale Mr. Sterling. The smug confidence drained from the company man's face, replaced by a dawning horror. The marshal folded the telegram deliberately and tucked it into his coat. He walked toward Sterling, pulling a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "Well, Mr. Sterling," the marshal said, his voice laced with contempt, "it seems you're a much more important man than we thought." He held up the telegram. "This is a federal warrant for embezzlement, fraud, and multiple counts of human trafficking across state lines. It seems the Transcontinental Railway Company has been looking for you for months. These indenture contracts," he gestured with the cuffs toward the paper in his other hand, "are all fraudulent, worthless." He snapped one cuff onto Sterling's wrist. "You're under arrest." Mrs. Gable let out a small, horrified gasp from the carriage, her moment of triumph curdling into a spectacle of public humiliation. As the marshal led the sputtering, defeated Sterling away, he paused and tipped his hat to Elias. "Looks like you had your affairs in order after all," he said, a small, grudging smile on his lips. The crisis was over. The hunter had been caught in his own trap. The spring that followed was a time of quiet, steady transformation. The snow receded, unveiling a land green with new life, and the harsh, unforgiving world of winter gave way to the gentle promise of the thaw. The change in season was mirrored in the life of the small homestead. The oppressive silence that had once defined the cabin was gone, replaced by the soft, ambient sounds of a life being lived. May's laughter could often be heard as she chased butterflies in the new meadow grass, a sound as bright and welcome as the birdsong in the mornings. The clatter of pots and pans, the low murmur of conversation, the rhythmic thud of an axe-splitting wood, these were the sounds that now filled the space, chasing the last of the ghosts from the corners. The physical space was changing too. On the west side of the cabin, the skeleton of a new room was taking shape. Elias worked on it every day, the sound of his hammer a steady, purposeful heartbeat. It was a tangible symbol of their new reality, an expansion of the small fortress to make it a proper home. He was no longer just occupying the space, he was building onto it, making room for the future. In the yard, Lynn had cultivated a small, thriving garden, rows of green shoots pushed up through the dark, rich earth, a testament to her patient, nurturing hand. She had transformed a patch of barren ground into a place of sustenance and beauty, just as her presence had transformed the barren landscape of Elias's life. The people themselves were transformed. Elias was no longer a man defined by his grief. The hard lines of solitude around his eyes had softened. He still possessed his quiet strength, but it was no longer a purely defensive wall. Now it was a protective canopy under which his new family flourished. He smiled more, a slow, rare thing that transformed his weathered face. He would watch May play, or listen as Lynn read to her in the evenings, and a deep, settled peace would fill him, a feeling he had thought was lost to him forever. Lynn, in turn, was no longer a desperate refugee living on the edge of survival. The constant fear had receded from her eyes, replaced by a calm confidence. She was a partner in every sense of the word, her intelligence and resilience now assets in building their shared life, not just tools for enduring hardship. The town, having witnessed the public downfall of both Mrs. Gable's social tyranny and Mr. Sterling's criminal enterprise, slowly began to change its tune. Respect, grudging at first, began to replace suspicion. They were no longer the hermit and his strays. They were a family who had faced down a powerful enemy and won. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold, the three of them sat on the porch. The new room was nearly finished, its fresh-cut pine scenting the air. May was asleep inside, tired out from a day of exploration. A peaceful quiet settled over them, a comfortable silence that was the polar opposite of the crushing emptiness that had once filled the cabin. Lynn looked out at the vast, beautiful wilderness that had become her sanctuary, but a shadow of the past, a faint echo of her old insecurities, still lingered. She turned to Elias, her voice soft. After everything, she began, the question of vulnerable whisper. Who could ever truly love someone like me? Someone with so much baggage, from a world so different. Elias did not look at her at first. He continued to gaze out at the land, at the home they were building together. His voice, when he spoke, was low and certain, as solid as the mountains themselves, the man who already does. He then turned his head slowly and met her eyes. In his gaze, she saw no pity, no charity, no mere protection. She saw a profound quiet and unshakable truth. It was the end of a long journey, and the beginning of everything else.